So before we get started, I first want to acknowledge and celebrate the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose unceded lands the Australian National University is built and upon which we meet today. I pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. And as this is a hybrid seminar, I wish to acknowledge that we have participants joining us from outside of Canberra, and therefore any participants on Zoom are invited to add your own acknowledgements in country to the chat. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar in the Deep Conversations series, a collaboration between the ANU Centres for Environmental History and Laureate Research Centre for Deep History. The purpose of today's seminar is to discuss the rise of digital mapping as both a tool for historical research and as a form of public communication for historians and humanities scholars. And to do this, we're lucky to be joined by 4 scholars who have been involved in some of the best known mapping projects in Australia and who are currently involved in a range of extremely exciting projects. Mike Jones is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Research Centre for Deep History here at ANU. He'll be discussing the Centre's ongoing Marking Country project, which aims to develop a deeper understanding of Australia's pre-1788 history, transforming the scale and scope of history through the analysis of Australia's epic Indigenous narratives, alongside relevant new scientific evidence, creating new approaches to the history of Greater Australia. Fiannuala Morgan is a PhD student at the ANU and a librarian at the National Library of Australia. And she'll be discussing her current research project on the application of digital mapping software to the analysis of 19th century Australian fiction. Emma Thomas, who is on Zoom, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Laureate Centre for History and Population at the University of New South Wales. The current book project analyses the intersections of gender and sexuality, labour regimes, demographic crisis, and colonial violence in Papua New Guinea under German rule. And she'll be talking to us today about her collaboration with Associate Professor Emma Christopher on the project Mapping Histories of Blackbirding and the Pacific Labour Trade. And Bill Pascoe, who is a digital humanities specialist and currently the system architect on Time-Layered Cultural Map, National Digital Humanities Mapping Infrastructure Project. He has wide experience across a range of digital humanities projects, including with the Colonial Frontier Massacres project at the University of Newcastle. How the seminar will go from here is I'm going to hand over to each of our presenters in turn, who will give an overview of their projects for roughly 10 to 15 minutes, more likely 15, I think I can confidently say. And then I'm just going to ask a few questions of our panel to reflect on sort of the skills, the questions, the research processes, and some of the ethical considerations that underpin their work. And then we'll open the floor and Zoom room to questions. So with that, I will hand over to Mike to kick us off.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Thank you, Rowan. Thanks for having me along to this session today. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and pay my respects to elders past and present. I welcome any First Nation people joining us in the session today. So I'm the Deputy Director of the Research Centre for Deep History here at the School of History at ANU. And the Research Centre was launched on 30th of October 2019. It emerged out of the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Programme, Rediscovering the Deep Human Past, Global Networks, Future Opportunities. So that's a 5-year laureate programme that runs until February next year, February 2023. I joined the laureate a couple of years in and ANU in July 2019. And I came to this project with a background as an archivist, a collections consultant, and a historian. And I both worked on and led a number of digital humanities and digital public history projects at primarily the University of Melbourne with a bunch of collaborators. So I was kind of brought onto the project in some ways due to that expertise as much as my expertise as a historian, because there were conversations in the Laureate and in the Research Centre about the idea of developing an interactive digital atlas that could tell us more about the deep history of the Australian continent. The ideas behind this was that this would sort of speak back to and counter the kind of long-standing understanding that people have of the way that the continent has been mapped that comes through a very kind of European perspective of mapping. So this kind of perspective, this is Thevenot's map from the late 17th century or mid-17th century, the first known European map produced that was devoted entirely to the Australian continent. And this shows European knowledge of that region in 1644 with the northern, western, and some of the southern coastlines as explored by the Dutch. This was taken over by colonial maps like Stanford's new map of Australia from 1864. This has the sort of familiar state and territory boundaries emerging. It also maps colonial infrastructures and the pathways of explorers and exploration routes across the continent, which is most visibly seen in maps like this 1960s pictorial map of Australia, which is an exploration map and is all about the kind of white explorers traversing this landscape and what they discovered along the way. So we wanted to move away from these sorts of representations and the periodization of kind of mapping and landscape that kind of pivoted around that colonial moment, and look at broader stories, broader histories in collaboration with Indigenous communities around the country. Now, I did some early tests in the first few months, and I'm just going to talk a bit about the kind of evolution of how we got to where we are today as part of this. So I did some experiments in the kind of early days thinking, well, what sort of data could we start playing with? What sort of things could we do here? So this is a shapefile of Australia. I was interested in bunyips at the time, and I was looking at bunyip sightings and the way that these tied into long-standing kind of cultural stories and traditions about landscape, about environment, about waterways, about usage of resources that had a lot of really interesting knowledge kind of built in about the, things like bunyips coming to get people because of overfishing in particular areas that were actually about resource management in particular areas over really long periods of time. But these are bunyip sightings from newspaper reports in Trove that I geolocated. Interestingly, a lot of these did have also reports of Aboriginal people's accounts of what these creatures or beings might be. When you're talking about bunyips, you talk about waterways, and this is a slightly sketchy waterways shapefile. But you immediately start running into problems of, well, where do you find, shapefiles or geolocated data of historic waterways at different periods in time over kind of long periods of time? And you quite quickly run into some data issues about how to do this within the constraints of what in the grand scheme of things is a relatively short project with not many people involved. There were other sorts of data I thought we could layer in here. Again, just experimenting. There was some thought that the sound of the Australasian bittern might be mistaken for the kind of booming roar of a bunyip. So I was looking at, well, where are these sightings in the 19th century? And Australasian bittern sightings across that area by the Atlas of Living Australia that show some really interesting kind of clustering around some of the sites where bunyips were also reported to be sighted. There are other theories about leopard seals, which seem slightly more dubious because there's never been a recorded sighting of a leopard seal on any of these inland waterways. And you look how far inland some of these kind of sites are. And in terms of long histories, there were some thoughts about bunyips might be potentially being related to extinct megafauna like the protodon. And you can get some data from things like Fossil 2.0 of diprotodon finds around this part of the country. I also did some mapping that I'm not going to show, and I'll let you know why, but the IATSIS map of Indigenous Australia, just interested to see whether some of these locations clustered in particular language groups or communities and potentially, as potential collaborators that we could work with. But for those who don't know, the IATSIS map of Indigenous Australia comes with usage restrictions on it that says that you shouldn't overlay images or text and you shouldn't add geospatial mapping. So although I did that kind of on my personal computer, I'm not going to show it here. Then the pandemic hit, and here's a pandemic map, given we're talking maps. This obviously put real constraints on our field work and started to reshape the kind of projects that we were trying to do in the research centre. But also, I mean, you look at a map like this from the pandemic, and it's a very data-intensive map. It's about mapping, quite large-scale data sets compared to what we were looking at. And it comes with a bunch of questions of, well, what is deep history data? What does deep history data look like? What sort of data sets are we talking about here? and does this kind of data intensive mapping approach and GIS approach bring anything that's kind of relevant or useful to the deep history field? And when looking at data intensive mapping and the experiments that I just showed, there's actually a real problem there. One of the reasons that I didn't continue with them, because there are problems with that in that it uses colonial newspapers as sources, it uses Western scientific data, and putting those two things together. It's potentially open to claims, perhaps quite rightly, that it's an attempt to kind of validate stories of bunyips and Indigenous knowledge using Western scientific data to prove whether it's true. And this can come with real kind of intellectual and philosophical issues, and it just didn't sit right with the work that we were trying to do. So we moved away from that really data-intensive approach and thought, well, we're not going to be producing maps here that are about many, many locations and sites right across the continent with really kind of large-scale GIS data sets. We looked at possibly doing archival work, particularly during the pandemic, but there are significant issues there too. You know, we can't just mine knowledge out of the archives, even if it's officially on the public record, and start putting this stuff on maps and making them publicly accessible and visible, because that's opening up a whole kind of range of information that potentially was collected under dubious circumstances, and you still need to do the community relationship work around that. And there was some talk about mapping sites related to the long human history of the continent that were already known and open, like Indigenous tourism sites, and working with communities that ran tourism operations in different parts of the country. And that wasn't quite clear what we were adding to that equation other than kind of aggregating existing data under a kind of deep history lens. So we started to move in different directions. By the end of 2021, we had a very kind of rough demo version just to show people the stage of the work that we were at, that we showed at the Australian Historical Association conference. I'm just going to run some very short highlights from that. So we had a few stories from different locations around the country. There was a national map down the bottom with some clickable sites that I'll show you more in a moment. This was a very kind of text-heavy version of this. It was probably a bit too academic for the approach that we ultimately want to take. It included things about geological timescales and changing environments. When you got down to the further down in these stories, there were embedded leaflet maps with clickable locations, some information there. There we go, that's still going. And this is a more of the sort of full screen atlas component of it, where we had clickable sites around the country. This is zooming in on Greek Island with a few sites there, and you could click on sites and get some information about, for example, the creation of these landscapes. And we also had shape files for things like changing coastlines, and we had 3 shape files at different depth levels so that we could show that changing coastline. So this is where we were at the end of 2021. Emerging from all of this, though, it became increasingly clear through this that the deep history work was about deep engagement and co-creation with communities working at a really local level. And rather than these kind of national perspectives and continually focusing on this continental perspective, we started to develop stories at a local level that were actually quite visually distinct in many ways for the individual communities that we were working with. And so the approaches started to emerge directly from those community relationships. So I'm just going to step through a few of the examples of where we're headed for this. This is still kind of work in progress. But for example, Ben Silverstein and I are doing work with the Yalu community up around Broome, and that's Broome in the top of this image you can see there with the curve of Roebuck Bay. And down the bottom of Roebuck Bay is a really significant cultural landscape that then became Thangu Pastoral Station, and there were various kind of access issues and things around that landscape. But this was a story, although there are significant sites here of things like Indigenous wells that were also used for droving cattle through this country, and we may plot some of those and geolocate some of those sites as part of this story. It's also a story of movement, of people moving backwards and forwards around this bay, of people coming across the bay on boats at different times, and even of people looking across the bay, either being in Broome and looking across to Thangu Station and remembering time there, or being on Thangu Station and looking back across to Broome. So it's about kind of movement and perspective through this landscape, and we're looking at different ways of capturing that's not just about having kind of geolocated individual sites. We're looking at incorporating some Indigenous ways of mapping. This is a map of part of the Palmer River in Queensland that's part of a rock art site on Quincan country on Cape York Peninsula. Some of the sites here are believed to be somewhere between kind of 15 and 30,000 years old as rock art sites. This image of the river is not thought to be that old, but is it's still really interesting to see different ways of kind of drawing diagrams of different parts of this country. Also working with community members. This is Leah Umbagai on the Western Kimberley, who sees the naming of her country and the animals and beings of that country in language as a really important part of conveying knowledge about that country, and painted this kind of mud map of the area with the her own icons on there and having the language names attached to those. So rather than using kind of satellite images and using those more familiar mapping tools, we're creating digital versions of this map and using the icons that she drew to then place in different places on that map. We may animate some of them, include the language names. And so it's a representation of that country that has emerged directly from the community members that we're working with. We're looking to draw on existing knowledge that's already out there. I showed you the Groot Islands version from the 2021 demo, where we had 3 sites on that landscape. This is from the Anindiliaqua Land Council, and these are the names of coastal locations in language from around Groot Island, and you can see the extraordinary level of kind of cultural knowledge and cultural naming that happens in this landscape. So we want to draw on some of this work and help reveal some of that within this kind of broader context. This is some work that Amy Way has been doing following a trip that she and Anne McGrath did up to Carnarvon Gorge with Uncle Fred Conway and Professor Jackie Huggins. And thinking about stories like this that do have sites on a map, and some really interesting sites on a map, but also is about the kind of movement through country and the journey and experience of walking through this country with elders and with members of the community who tell you things along the way and tell you about bush medicines or different types of trees, or telling stories about the landscape as they move through. So capturing some of that kind of experience of moving through country as part of stories like this. And we do still have some very data-rich maps, but in a different sort of way to the shapefiles and things I showed earlier. So this is a painted map of the Willandra Lakes district, painted by Kim Mahood, working with communities and families in that region. And the reason why it's so small on here is the actual map itself is like a couple of meters wide. It's on a huge canvas that takes a big wall to hang it on. It has coloured maps of or sort of diagrams of families moving through the landscape, where people were born, where people married, where they worked, movement in and out of missions, really rich kind of family stories on this also ancient landscape, because it's surrounding Lake Mungo and that kind of area that's very familiar from a deep history perspective. And so it's overlaying these kind of family histories on a deep history landscape, and looking at creating a digitized version of this that's well underway, where we've pulled that painted map apart into sort of vector layers with each of the family stories as a separate layer. So you can bring different family stories in and out. You can potentially animate some sections of it and provide a real kind of digital interface where people can explore this as a kind of rich set of community data and knowledge about that region. So those are the kind of community specific directions we're heading in. As you can see, they're all a little distinct, because that's emerging from those local engagements with communities and stepping away from the kind of national atlas level that we might have initially thought. As to what it all looks like when it's finished, we need to wait a few more months. It's due for launch on the 22nd of November 2022. I'm sure it will be widely publicised around that time. So watch out for Marking Country, Mapping Deep Histories coming in late November. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to hand over to Fiannuala Morgan now.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present today. It's really exciting to not only get to present this research, but to present it within the context of historians as well. My background is mostly cultural studies. I'm in literature now, so it's kind of a real privilege to get to share the space with historians. And thank you for your presentation, Mike. It was really interesting, and I can see some intersections with stuff that I'm thinking about non-cartographic approaches to mapping cultural texts. But today I'd like to present some research from my PhD. This is the first section of my PhD, which is about exploring the relationship between bushfire reporting and fictional representations of bushfires in 19th century texts that were published in Australian newspapers. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from unceded Aboriginal land today, and to pay my respects to any Indigenous people here in the room or on Zoom as well. So the intention behind this particular project was to explore the relationship between bushfire reporting and fiction in 19th century Australian newspapers. I'll try and just give a brief overview of the project itself, as well as the digital methodology that I used, and also indicate, I suppose, gesture towards the research potential of this particular kind of approach to mapping, but also highlight the difficulties and shortcomings as well. So the final map that I'm showing here is composed of two primary data sets. So the historical bushfire data set is derived from about 5,000 newspaper articles that mention bushfires that was harvested from Australian newspapers across the 19th century, mostly 1850 to 1900. And these are represented by the red dots that you can see. The fiction that was used for this research was extracted from about 243 novellas and short stories that reference bushfires that were also published in Australian newspapers across the 19th century, and these are represented by those green dots. So I was very much interested in the idea that you have the kind of fictionalization and the reportage happening in the same material kind of medium, and was interested in the potential that mapping could bring to bringing those two things back together, I suppose, in a different format. So to construct this map, I used two primary approaches or technologies, which was named entity recognition, and then also a custom querying of the Gazetteer of Historical Australian Place Names from the time-laid cultural map, which Bill actually helped me with this project. So it's exciting to present it with you today. So just very basically, named entity recognition identifies proper nouns, predominantly locations, organizations, or persons in unstructured text. So I use this to just very kind of brutally pull out place names from both genres of writing. The place names that I extracted from the collection of the bushfire fiction, though, did not, and mostly don't in any way necessarily correlate with the location of the bushfire within the narrative itself, which is what I was really interested in trying to identify. And ultimately, the only way that I could find the locations of these bushfires in the fiction and assign the correct geographic location was by reading them more closely. So this wasn't the case, though, with the newspaper articles. Named entity recognition is domain dependent, so it is designed for, and it's most effective at extracting event-related information from journalistic text. And usually it responds to these 5 typical questions in the journalism domain of what, where, when, who, and why, which are capable of summarizing events and news. And accordingly, this could be used remarkably well to capture the geographic location of the bushfires in the newspaper reporting. And based on the formalism of newspaper reporting, it was also possible to develop a rule-based approach to the identification of geographic information pertaining to historical fires, just by isolating my search to a 200-word proximity surrounding the string, the word bushfire itself. I was able to extract location entities of meaningful semantic significance to my research question, which was, what is the geographic location of bushfires in these articles? And so this diagram shows the two pipelines that we use to generate both data sets. And as you can see here, I couldn't use the same pipeline for both corpuses, the journalism and the fiction. Really, it was just necessary to read the fiction to identify the location of the fire within the narrative. It couldn't be computationally automated. Now, the difficulty in attributing a geographic location to fires in fiction through the use of named entity recognition comes down to the fact that geographic indeterminacy is really a very important feature of literature itself. And based on close reading, indeterminate locations were actually one of the most prominent settings for these narratives, so where the fire was taking place. In other instances, I couldn't resolve the location beyond the identification of a colony. And even if a narrative did mention the location of a bushfire by place name, and optimistically, this was also accurately identified by the algorithm, the classifier itself, there really was no formal or rule-based way to disambiguate the relevance of this particular place name from other place names within that chapter. So despite these limitations, this approach still did lead to some important research findings, albeit ones that were much more circumscribed in scope than I initially envisioned. So based on this acknowledgement of how differently named entity recognition handled different genres of writing, at this stage, I started to think of it more as a form of information retrieval that would help direct me towards close reading or what to read, rather than as a tool that would produce two comparative data sets to be interpreted through statistical analysis. So my approach to reading the map that I constructed was guided by the well-known expression from geographer and cartographer Walter Chodler, who argued that everything is related, but near things are more related than distant things. And I used some fairly accessible digital mapping software just to add hyperlinks back to the original text of the newspaper articles and of the fiction, and then also a timeline and other filtering devices, so I could now read the moments of geographic convergence between the data sets. This fairly simplistic approach did reveal the enduring significance of the fire disaster Black Thursday that took place on February the 7th, 1851, in bushfire fiction and in the reporting across the 19th century. Black Thursday was perhaps the first major fire disaster since European colonisation, and although no official records exist, it's estimated that almost a quarter of the colony of Victoria was burned. Narrative accounts of Black Thursday demonstrate a clearly identifiable relationship with journalistic accounts of the event. That is, there's this strong alignment between the place names featured in reporting on the event and in the fiction itself. Moreover, the place names in narrative accounts of Black Thursday correspond directly with the narrative setting of the stories, as the authors are clearly choosing to position the narratives in areas that were identifiably affected by the disaster. And so this is just some of the stories that mention Black Thursday, as well as the place names that occur across the reporting of that event and of the fiction. So based on this finding, I attempted to identify narratives of more localized or defined geographies. And I started thinking about using place names to create these minimal bounded areas that I was thinking of as geographic extents of narratives. And as was the case with just kind of looking for these moments of convergence between the two data sets, so the red dots and the green dots occurring together, this particular approach, based on this definition of geographic extent, revealed Black Thursday stories to be those with the most clearly defined narratives, most clearly defined geographies. So the narratives of the smallest geographic extent included the serials Black Thursday, published in 1856 by William Howard, and Whose Crime, published in 1894, which I, through this process, discovered to actually be just a plagiarism of William Howard's narrative. So the map on the right is just one of the chapters from William Howard's short story, which puts the opening of that story in the Apollo Bay region. So Black Thursday, published in 1856 by William Howard, is the only bushfire narrative that to my knowledge, is consistently republished in Australian newspapers for the remainder of the 19th century. It's a tale of settler endurance that features protagonist Robert Patterson successfully navigating the devastation of Black Thursday. It's partly a revision of Howard's own reporting on the event that drew together different newspaper accounts to present a sensational report of unprecedented destruction. While Howard's reporting presents Black Thursday as a disaster without parallel, he also contextualizes the event as entirely avoidable, the cumulative product of drought and the indiscriminate use of fire. He gestures towards complacency by new settlers and the Victorian government, as he notes that there is a legal penalty for leaving a fire unattended, but, quote, nobody ever regards it because I do not believe it's ever inflicted, end quote. Despite this, fire historian Paul Collins argues that the practical lessons that could have been learned from the disaster were quickly forgotten, setting a pattern that has been followed after every major fire disaster since. It was only 6 days after Black Thursday that Edward Hargraves discovered nuggets of gold west of Bathurst, thereby setting in motion mass emigration to Australia as prospectors sought fortune in gold. 5 months after Black Thursday and only 2 weeks after Victoria had been declared an independent colony, gold was discovered east of Melbourne on the Yarra River. The disaster baptised the new colony and perfectly prepared the land for prospecting. It would take nearly half a century and another major fire disaster for significant fire reform to eventually be implemented. The reasons for this are unclear, and available fire histories of Australia are largely silent on the years intervening between Black Thursday in 1851 and the next reported fire disaster, Red Tuesday, that took place at the end of the century in 1898. Again, Paul Collins argues that the lack of primary material for the period can be attributed to the ubiquity of fires, and he writes that it's clear from many 19th century sources that bushfires had become an inescapable part of summer life in Australia. But the history of bushfires in the second half of the century is fragmentary because they were so common, they were not reported unless they were close to settled districts, widespread or disastrous. Reviewing the articles on the bush map through close reading, however, it became apparent why an argument for underreporting might have been falsely assumed. Although some news articles do contain headlines that detail destructive bushfires, many of the articles are just correspondence reporting that are providing updates on a region, as can be seen in the article on the left, that's a report on Newcastle, or this information might be encapsulated in other general area reporting, as is the case with the article on the right titled The Country. 19th century settler fire histories bookended by Black Thursday, 1851, and Red Tuesday, 1898, with relatively little that's written about the intervening years. The observation that reporting of bushfires may have changed across the century led me to identify a third major disaster, Black Monday, that took place the 27th of February in 1865. In journalistic accounts, Black Monday is described as the second great fire disaster of the colony. Nonetheless, it quickly fades from cultural memory, and by the turn of the century, the event is completely forgotten when it's excluded from the list of significant fires in the Victorian Royal Commission into Fire Protection in Country Districts in 1900. Across the late 1870s and early 1880s, Victoria experienced regular and devastating bushfires, but unlike the extensive multi-page features that followed disasters such as Black Thursday and Black Monday, bushfire reporting became increasingly succinct. This shift in reporting, as well as the retroactive erasure of Black Monday as a significant disaster, seems to support historians' claims that fires did become more frequent and severe across the period of the 1870s and 80s. But to return to my focus on the relationship between reporting and fiction, the inability to connect other bushfire narratives with historical fires beyond Black Thursday may be partially attributable to the fact that across the 19th century, and is evidenced by Black Monday, the category of disaster itself was seemingly unstable. The nomenclature Black Monday is seemingly erased as bushfires of greater geographic scale and fatalities occurred with increased frequency. The enduring cultural significance of Black Thursday in fiction and reporting, however, both normalises and diminishes the severity of subsequent bushfires. In journalistic accounts, Black Thursday is often invoked as a means of contextualising and containing the scale of disaster. And in fiction, Black Thursday is presented as an unfortunate accident that can be attributed to the careless use of fire rather than the result of the systemic impacts of colonisation, the alteration of the land's biota through agricultural practices, and the interruption of Indigenous fire management regimes. Rather than ensuring that the practical lessons of disaster are heeded, these narratives then seem to only operate to reassure settler culture that Black Thursday was an aberration, an accident, and part of the growing pains of the new colony. That is, of course, until the next disaster. Thank you.
I expected that to be more difficult than it was, because I am not a digital expert at all. Very excited to be here though, and to learn about these projects and present this one. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'll begin by acknowledging that I am on the unceded lands of the Bedigal people up here in Sydney. I pay my respects to Bedigal people and their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander peoples present here today. Okay, my talk today is called Mapping Histories of Blackbirding and the Pacific Labour Trade. And in it, I'm going to provide an overview of a database and digital mapping project that my colleague here at UNSW, Emma Christopher, and I are working on in collaboration with Imelda Davis, chairwoman of the Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson. So this project is very much in its infancy, but we think it will provide really critical new knowledge and awareness about the mobilisation and exploitation of Pacific Islanders as labourers, both in colonial Australia and elsewhere in the Pacific. So many of us here today, I'm sure, will be familiar with the labour system known as the Pacific labour trade. That system of cheap migrant labour recruited to serve expanding European economic and imperial interests across the Pacific Ocean in the 19th and 20th centuries. An estimated 1.5 million Pacific Islanders and a further 500,000 Asians were embroiled in this labour regime between 1863 and the outbreak of World War II. So we're talking about large numbers of people. They were transported from their homes in places ranging from India to Kiribati, principally to provide labour for European-owned plantations in Fiji, Samoa, and of course, Northern Australia. Within historiographies of the labour trade, perhaps the key debate in the literature has been about whether and to what extent the trade was characterised by coercion or by consent. From the outset, excuse me, here we go. From the outset, the labour trade had its European critics who characterised it as nothing other than an extension of the slave trade. Blackbirding, as many of us here will know, became the shorthand for this slavery-like system of forced labour migration in which labourers were, quote unquote, recruited largely through acts of violence, kidnapping and trickery. Some scholars, however, have critiqued this narrative for its failure to take Pacific Islanders' role in the labour trade into consideration. The island-centred historiographies that emerged largely out of ANU beginning in the 1960s and 70s complicated a straightforward interpretation of the labour indenture as slavery. Placing Islanders' agency at the centre of their analyses, these works have productively challenged Eurocentric narratives of imperial activity, highlighting instead processes of exchange and entanglement. The picture that is subsequently emerging of the labour trade is a complex one, demanding attention be paid to local situations, to a variety of historical actors, and to specific episodes and instances that mark recruitment across the Pacific. Historians know that colonialism was and is inherently and systematically violent. Questions still remain about how Pacific Islanders and colonists alike navigated, contested, and reconfigured relations of power, violence, subordination, and exploitation in this context. And these are some of the questions we are seeking to address with the development of the Pacific Islander Labour database. And I'll say more about that shortly. I want to briefly discuss some of the sources from my archives that are helping us to tell these stories. And as mentioned, I'm a historian of the German Pacific, so I'll be focusing on those sources here. So the documents you see here are pages from the accounts of two traders who in 1883 were stationed on what is today New Ireland, Papua New Guinea. The trader whose account you see on the left was stationed at Kapsu. The one on the right was stationed at Noosa. These are both located toward the northwestern end of the island, which was a fertile ground for labour recruiters during this period. Both of these men were employed by the German trading company Hernsheim & Co., which had already established a presence in the islands and elsewhere in the Pacific prior to German annexation in 1884. Reading these accounts, certain familiar themes are evident. Recruiters exchanging firearms for New Guinean recruits, and the absence of any interpreters on board the recruitment ships, for instance. The accounts also detail the violence of the labour trade and provide insights into islanders' experiences of it. Take the following account of the Maria, for example. This was an English ship recruiting for Fiji. And this account is from the trader who was stationed at Noosa. The trader was on board a Queensland recruitment ship, the Kiara, conversing with the captain. Quote, when suddenly we saw the workers with whom I had found, sorry, I've done something to my text here, whom I had found on board the Maria, jumping overboard from all sides and swimming to both banks. The captain of the Maria was absent with his boats to recruit new labourers. A pursuit of the escapees could therefore not take place. The gunfire which the ship's crew opened on fleeing people was apparently unsuccessful. After a while, however, a boat was dispatched from the Kiara to help several people from the crew of the Maria who had jumped into the water to swim after the runaways. A woman belonging to the escaped labourers was attacked again from this boat. The woman was brought back on board the Maria and there beaten bloody and put in irons. When this trader had earlier been aboard the Maria, he found 76 recruits on board who were all locked in a room below the deck with only one small hatch open. They were allowed on deck for just 2 hours a day under close supervision of the ship's crew. So given this, it should come as no surprise that these people took the opportunity to flee when they had the chance. So this is another kind of document that I work with in my research on German colonial New Guinea, and this is a recruitment log. These became standard in the German colony, and they provide some important insights into the history of this labour trade. From documents like this, we can learn the names of people who were recruited, or at least how they sounded to the person doing the recruiting. We can learn their gender, their approximate age, the date they were recruited, and from which village or location. We can also learn about the duration of the labour contract, the nominal monthly wage they would have received, and the entity for whom they were recruited. And in this particular case from 1904, it was the German colonial administration doing the recruiting, using this ship, the Zabra, to transport these people from today's New Ireland to the colonial capital in Herbertshoa, which is today's Kokopo in New Britain. We can see how these individuals left their marks or signatures on the recruitment record, ostensibly an indication of a freely entered into contract or consent. But of course, we also have sources that directly and explicitly contradict the idea that all recruitment was consensual. This, for example, is the record of a case that came before a German colonial court in 1902. And it involves the same recruitment ship that I just mentioned, the Zabra. Again, recruiting for the German administration in New Guinea. Records like this one contain the mediated testimonies of so-called recruits, and I think they are critical sources for understanding how the Pacific labour trade in all its variants manifested on the ground. This particular case tells the story of a woman named Galdu from Ballio Island off the coast of mainland New Guinea near present-day Madang. Galdu had been taken aboard the Zabra from her home to be transported to the colonial capital of Herbertshohe and delivered to a German colonial judge who had apparently bought her from a colleague on the mainland who had himself recently returned on leave to Germany. Testifying before the colonial court, Galdu's words went something like this. This morning, the captain came with his crew to Ballio and tried to convince the men there to go with him to Herbertshohe. The men didn't comply. The captain then threatened them. He started ranting. The men then ran away. Only Nylon stayed behind with me, and he persuaded me to get in a canoe in which he took me to the ship, but only because he had to. Nylon himself said that he only did this out of fear because otherwise their homes might be burned down. When I left my people, we all cried. I absolutely wanted to go back, but I was scared because the captain ranted a lot, so I stayed on board. The Ballio people refused the trade goods that were offered to them. A few sticks of tobacco were left on Ballio, but the men wouldn't smoke them. So with sources like this, the violence and coercion that characterised the colonial labour indenture are palpable. The threats and fears of reprisals for non-compliance are explicit, and there's a knowledge of what these reprisals could and did look like. The islanders' refusal of trade goods and their refusal to smoke the tobacco are also telling. They did not consent to Galdu's removal, and clearly neither did she. So sources like these, court records, recruitment logs, traders' accounts, among a host of other archival materials and contemporary newspaper sources, contain a whole host of information about the history of the Pacific labour trade. But these are sources that also remain inaccessible to many people due to issues of language, location, education, funding, etc. Which brings me back to the database project that Emma Christopher, to avoid confusion, and I are developing in collaboration with the Australian South Sea Islanders Port Jackson. So we're drawing upon the groundbreaking work achieved by the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which you can see here, and some of you may already be familiar with, to develop a Pacific Islander labour database that will function in much the same way as an extensive, searchable and online record of the colonial trade in Pacific Islanders. This database project is driven by a number of goals. Firstly, by amassing information on the labour trade and its various actors. It will itself serve as a critical tool for further research. But also through the database, we hope to make these critical histories of Pacific labour recruitment, migration and exploitation more broadly accessible. The prototype we are currently developing has begun to map labour recruitment voyages from the New Guinea Islands to Australia, Fiji, Samoa, and within New Guinea itself. So here is a screenshot. This is still very much under development. This is quite rough, but here's a screenshot of how we're going about this. And this is just the information from the Zabra that I showed you the archival file of before, entered into the database. Further, as you can see here, and this is where things get very exciting and I think really speak to the mapping part of this seminar. The database will allow us to map these individual voyages, showing where people were taken from and where they were sent. Location pins, Marking places where islanders boarded and disembarked recruitment vessels will be interactive, so as to maintain the qualitative information that we have available. So by clicking on any one of these pins, users of the database will be able to access known historical details of what happened at that place during the voyage in question. Just finally, a couple of final thoughts. By working with the Pacific Islander communities and their representatives, we're committed to building a tool that is both culturally sensitive and useful to those communities. Allying with the Find and Back Family initiative of the Australian South Sea Islander community, this database will allow Pacific Islanders and their diasporas to research their histories and potentially connect with lost family. Given ongoing resonances between the colonial labour trade and such initiatives as Australia's current Pacific Labour Scheme, we see an urgency and contemporary significance to this project. It will allow us to map long histories of labour extraction and exploitation that continue to this day. By providing a critical tool to researchers, educators, students, and others, the database will enable a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of our past and present, shedding new light on Australia's deep historical involvement in trans-imperial systems of unfree labour. Thank you.
Hey, hi everyone, and thanks for having me here today. I pay my respects to Fiannuala and Ngambri elders, past, present, and future. I'm here from the University of Melbourne, which is in Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country of the Kulin Nation. But most of the work on the Colonial Frontier Massacres map was done in Awabakal and Warramai country at the University of Newcastle. So the Colonial Frontier Massacres map project began 8 years ago in 2014 with an ARC grant. For 3 years, and was led by, and still is led by, Professor Lyndall Ryan at the University of Newcastle. The team has included a fair few historians from various parts of the country, each focusing on different states, and digital humanities software developers and research assistants. We released the map in stages, and we're just finalising a few things before concluding work and archiving the data. So we started with the east coast of Australia and then included Northern Territory and South Australia, and then West Australia, and also over time more sites emerged across the whole country. Each time we release a stage, this is stage 4 that we're looking at now, we do get feedback from the public, clarifying certain bits of information, sometimes giving us leads on sites. And so there's always a bit of a follow-up period where we make adjustments before we can call it done. So, but hopefully we will be finished soon and can archive it and get a DOI sorted and all of that sort of thing. Consultation on this included sessions conducted through Wallatuka at the University of Newcastle, meeting with IATSIS, conferences, community visits, personal contacts, and the project employed a Wiradjuri software developer and a Darug Gamilaroi research assistant. My involvement is as a digital humanities software developer. What I do though isn't just technical, but involves figuring out, well, it's quite interdisciplinary, really. I need to have a good understanding of the history and the political context and the ethical situations and how that crosses over with the technology. So that includes translating often very vague and sketchy historical information into structured data for the database, and considering the right way to represent it on the web ethically and yeah, sometimes in aggressive political context. So some examples of how that works in representation in politics, in the pragmatics of the project, and in what you might call digital humanities theory. So some specific examples are in terms of representation, the overall tone of the site. So one of the choosing the color of the dots, for example, was one of the first issues we had. We weren't expecting that to involve a lot of discussion, but it involved a heck of a lot of discussion and feedback from a lot of people. And we had to work our way through lots of different considerations. Color of a dot turns out to be quite important. For example, when I made a first draft and said, here's what it might look like, and showed it to the history team, the dots were red. That stands up as quite a contrasting bold color. But it looked like a horror movie, basically, like blood had been splattered all over the map of Australia, which some might say is apt, but it seemed kind of sensationalizing to me. Also, some people we consulted with said, don't use red because for us, that's a color of celebration. And we ended up yellow, I guess mainly just for two reasons. One is it stands out well, but also nobody objected to yellow. And also just considerations like not having any pictures on the site out of respect for people, rather than saying, rather than providing that usual warning, this may contain pictures that may upset people. We just thought, let's just respect that properly and not have pictures. The naming of sites, also a very difficult problem to grapple with. Many of the sites we know occurred in a certain place, but there's not like the Myall Creek massacre is a kind of like a massacre with a name. The Myall Creek massacre, it's well known. But a lot of the massacres we didn't have an established name to work with. It's not my place to name these sites, and yet we can't consult with every single community across the country. So that was quite difficult. In the end, we just chose what seemed to be the most sensible name, but leave it open for people to request it be changed and corrected, which has happened in some cases. So in terms of the politics of it, it is very politically sensitive, especially because of the history wars, or the history of the history wars. So that involves, specific questions as well, like what to include and what to exclude. Some, we even had to just decide whether to include massacres of colonists or not. What sort of comments is that going to generate in social media if we don't include them, and if we do include them, thinking through those sorts of issues. Establishing policies for reusing the information, figuring out some of the terminology we use. Do we call people who commit massacres perpetrators, killers, murderers, attackers? And also, what's our attitude and our stance? Do we engage in social media or not? And well, in a lot of cases, it's come down to not taking the bait from people like massacre denialists who are trying to generate a controversy again, because this is about reconciliation. So we don't want to get into a big argument about it. We want to, and our role in academia is to reliably inform public debate. So that's what we try and do. And it turns out that has worked out quite well. When you see arguments in social media, you see people saying things which are obviously wrong. Somebody else comes in and says, actually, no, you can see on the map that provides this evidence. And so it's fulfilling its function in that way. And I guess in terms of the pragmatics of the project, there's a lot of the stuff you normally find in digital humanities projects, where the information you have is quite vague. It's in prose form, it's not in tables and that sort of thing. So for me, working with the historians, we had to put a lot of effort into figuring out how to turn that information into something that can be processed by a computer. you know, what are the categories that would make sense in an Excel spreadsheet, for example. And also how not to lose sight of the important historical context and the historical stories while we're doing that. So as well as the map, well, if you go to the introduction, there is, sorry, the mouse is being a bit sensitive there. Sorry. So one way to put it, make sure it has contextualizing information is with all the other pages, such as the introduction, which describes the evidence, explains the data, some of the process we went through. And also in each of the sites, oops, sorry. Each of the sites, I'll just pick one. Each one has a, you go to the details. Yeah, so these are the sort of the data type information that we established, but we also have a section for the narrative, which enables the historians to put in all of that background. What was the lead up? What was the follow up? In anything else that's relevant, so that we don't lose that in the process of creating structured data. In terms of some of the interesting digital humanity theory stuff that came out of this is thinking about the difference between like what your digital humanities project is for in relation to your research. Is it there to illustrate your theory? Is it there to provide a research tool to others? Or is it to answer a specific research question? So is it just to sort of engage people with your research findings, or to specifically answer the question, or provide a tool for others? And I mean, you kind of need to think about that when you're starting a project, but it's often the case that it fulfills all three functions. And I think that's the case with this one. Well, one of the more interesting things for me was when somebody asked, well, how do you prove, you know, in relation to that, if this is going to answer a research question, say the research question is, did massacres occur close to the frontier or not? This was from someone overseas who isn't familiar with Australian history, and like, because for us, if you look at the map, it's pretty clear it matches the frontier over time. But he wanted us to demonstrate or prove that computationally, which, and to do that, sorry, the mouse is acting up again. Oh, sorry, it's because the Zoom thing is in the way. So for an Australian person, as we look at this over time, we can see that it matches the pattern of colonisation, Sydney, Tasmania, Victoria, and then expanding up into the north. But in order to demonstrate that massacres occur close to the frontier computationally, you would need to know where the frontier is. But it turns out nobody seems to, we don't know where it is. Settlers didn't follow any government constraints. The geography of Australia means that it's very sparse and sporadic. It's not like it starts one place and then gradually expands. It's very patchy. There are all sorts of problems in trying to even figure out where the frontier is, which is actually something we're working on now in the follow-up to this project. And so you need to reverse that question and say that the massacres themselves indicate where the frontier is. Well, where the frontier is, if you want to answer the question, where is the frontier? Massacres are one data set that will indicate that. Other data sets might be when were towns founded, where did explorers go, pastoral expansion of sheep and cattle and those sorts of things. We can only infer where the frontier was from data sets like this. So that was just like an interesting theoretical thing that came out of this. So just, yeah, going back to the project in general then, out of about 414 frontier massacres on the map, 401 were of Aboriginal people, 12 were of colonists, and 1 was of Macassans. Those numbers are still fluctuating slightly. We may add or remove 1 or 2 sites, but they're pretty close to what we'll end up with once we finalise it. And our conservative estimate is that more than 10,000 people were killed in those massacres. So we use conservative estimates rather than a range, because the conservative estimate is going to be more accurate, whereas the, if you were to go from a minimum or a maximum, the maximum one is probably going to be wildly variant. So we just stick with the conservative one, and that also is for making a convincing argument as well, because of the politics and the debate around this. We want everything to be very defensible. So having a conservative estimate means it's going to stand up to just about anything. One of the new findings in stage 4 is that agents of the state were involved in about half of the massacres. So that's police, soldiers, government officials, which has often been a question in the past. To what extent did the government know what was going on, and did they condone it, and that sort of thing. So with 50% involved, it's pretty clear that they weren't ignorant of it. Though if you look into the actual, I mean, obviously the situation's more complicated than that. The government had well, at least in Victoria, I've just been looking into Victoria recently. The relationship of the government to settlers, on the one hand, the government was often quite annoyed with squatters for going beyond the law, and often critical of them for their violence and brutality and immorality. But at the same time, when they did send in the troops, such as the native police, the result was the same. They committed massacres and violence. It was just on the government's terms rather than the squatters' terms. Yeah, so one of the most important things about this map, and one of the reasons I think it's been so successful, having about 1 million views of this site, and then the Guardian's version of it, which is based on our data, and they augment it slightly. I don't know how many they've had, but it's probably quite a lot more. So that kind of means that just everyone in Australia would know someone who knows someone who has looked at the map, at least seen it. So that's kind of transformed this truth about our history from something that people only understood vaguely, or it just generally wasn't that well known, into something that's common knowledge. So I think it really has had an impact on Australian culture. And part of the reason for that is the storytelling aspect of it. And it's successful on the web, I think, because it only takes one look, just a glance, and you see that there were many massacres in Australia. We did have to resist a lot of scope creep in terms of things that could be added to the map, or different ways of visualizing it and having options down the side and that sort of thing. But I think keeping it simple has helped in its impact. And the storytelling of it, it sort of draws you in the more detail you want. So you can, there's the story that you get from a glance, there's the story over time that you get from the time slider, and there's the story of each individual site. And I think that helps people relate to it personally. Like, one of the powers of the map is that, you know, you typically go, well, where do I live? I can see my house from here or whatever. You can see what happened near where you live and work. So it gives those places, those events, much more tangibility, much more reality for you personally. You can see that, you know, the reason I'm able to live and work here is because of this violent history that happened just down the road. And it also, you know, kind of stories, places. Another power of the maps is that by reading the map, you learn something about a place, and then every time you pass that place or go through that place, it has more meaning to you, whereas before it didn't. That was just a hill until I saw the map and what happened to learn about it, but now it means something. And I think that changes the way we relate to places and changes the way we value them, and it also changes the way we think about ourselves and the way we value ourselves. I mean, I grew up in some pretty homogenous, nameless suburbs that didn't have any meaning at all. But on digging and doing some research, I found out there were interesting places that I just didn't know about them. It wasn't part of our education. So I think that's one of the powers of digital mapping, is to do that, to re-educate those of us who are ignorant of the meaning of places, especially the Indigenous meaning, but also the whole history of how we came to be here. Yeah, so that's the Colonial Frontier Massacres Map project, which is winding up. But after that, we have a new grant through the University of Melbourne called Historical Frontier Violence, Drivers, Legacy, and the Role of Truth-Telling. So this project looks at what happened before and after massacres, I guess is a way of summing it up. So what are the drivers of massacres? Why did they happen across the whole country? And the intergenerational impact up to today. It's been run through an economics department, so they're looking at that's quite data driven. That side, there's a quantitative side and a qualitative side of the next project. The quantitative side is quite data driven, so comparing locations of massacres to outcomes today for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and looking at settler attitudes as well. Differences in education, health outcomes, and so on, to establish if there is, to demonstrate the causal link between historical violence and the present circumstances. And the qualitative side, led by Judy Atkinson, is going to work with 3 communities around Australia, and part of the point behind that is that through understanding, according to Judy Atkinson's work, through understanding history, people can work through the healing process much better. If you understand why things are as they are, you can better understand that they're not necessarily that way, and that you can do something to change them. So yeah, one of the main parts of the next project is the healing capacity of understanding this violent history. Well, I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Bill. Sorry. Thank you, Bill, for a really fascinating and rich reflection on the map, which I think we can say probably, you know, for most people registering for this seminar, this is the map it comes to mind when you think about digital mapping in Australian history. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions of all of the panelists. while I'm doing that, do feel free, I think Amy's just put it in the chat actually, to start putting questions in the chat. I think it's going to be easiest if we put questions in the chat and then we'll read them out in the room for the sake of the recording. And we do also, we will need to change the audio very quickly for Emma to contribute. So do feel free to just like flag our attention with the raise hand function or something, Emma, when you want to jump in, and we'll do the manual switcheroo. So the question that I think I'm hoping a lot of people will be interested in is, could each of you just tell us a little bit about how you got into this world, this idea of using digital mapping as a tool for historical research and for communication? You know, how did you end up acquiring the skills that you need to do this? Is collaboration a big part of it? Can you reflect on that kind of your origin story, your mapping experience? I don't know if anyone wants to lead off. I think Bill has been volunteered.
Okay, sure. Yeah, just want to defer to others, but yeah. So I started out with an arts degree in English and philosophy. Then I had a baby and needed to get a job, and it was I know, at the end of the recession, I guess, in the 90s. But the IT boom was starting, so I kind of had to go into IT. There wasn't much choice about it. But it turned out I was pretty good at it. So I got work at the State Library and then at the University of Newcastle, I guess because I had the arts background as well. But it was in pretty mundane IT work. So, you know, over the course of 10 years, I also did honours and a PhD and managed to bring the boring IT work and the humanities stuff together. Through Professor Hugh Craig at the University of Newcastle, mainly, who was one of him and his supervisor were kind of seminal figures in digital humanities back in, well, I don't know how far back they go, but a long way. And then we made so other people like Ross Smith and Patricia Pender were interested in digital humanities and archives of women's literature, and a few other interested people formed a Centre of 21st Century Humanities, which I was doing the digital humanities work in, and through that met Lyndall, who had this grant and needed a digital map, and that's where we ended up with the colonial frontier massacres map. But mapping, I guess, particularly interests me as well, because I also traveled a lot when I was a teenager. So I just love looking at maps. So I'm happy to have volunteered.
From my point of view, so I'm not a digital mapping expert by any means, but I kind of come at this through the structured data side of things, coming through archival work, coming through collections, documentation, and working on public history projects that were using databases to capture metadata in structured ways that we could then use to talk about particular histories with broader audiences. With mapping being one of the kind of tools for visualizing that data in useful ways when you get your data structured right. So I kind of started at the data side of things rather than the visualizing side of things, but also done work in using things like network visualizations as part of kind of relational data sets, a little bit in kind of social network stuff, as well as geographic stuff, as well as other visualization tools. And in terms of developing those skills, I've worked with people who are mapping kind of experts in that space and picked it up. There's also, just from a basic point of view, I feel like sometimes as a digital humanities scholar, part of the key skill of being a scholar in that area is being able to search for stuff online and interpret the things that you read online and being able to apply it. So it's like, I know that that can be done, and I know that people have done that before. Therefore, if I search for this and look around for a while, I can find some instructions and work out how to do it myself and just kind of teach yourself based on all these available kind of forums of knowledge that are accessible. So yeah, I feel like the projects I've come to not knowing how to do the thing. I've come to it knowing how to find out how to do the thing, and then apply that in a useful kind of way.
Super. Did you want to read in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I work as a librarian and I've worked in libraries for the last decade or so as well. So I think I've always been interested in the expansion of digital archives and a qualitative kind of attitude towards digital material as kind of this positive thing for posterity or accessibility or whatnot. So I was interested in developing skills that would allow me to actually access and work with that material in a more direct sense. My PhD was a defined PhD for the humanities, which is quite unusual, which stipulated a geospatial analysis of colonial fiction based on the archive put together by my supervisor, Professor Catherine Bode. So I took on a project that basically I just had to learn how to be able to do computational work because I knew that would be the only way I would learn, because it is a steep learning curve. But I think what is exciting or humbling for me is that the perceived kind of distinction between qualitative or quantitative methods, or that kind of idea of this kind of deep chasm between the humanities and other kinds of disciplines is not as clearly delineated, I think, as might be initially perceived. And invariably, what's become kind of perhaps a misperception of my work about extracting something from text that I might hold up as some kind of knowledge claim is realizing that the kind of metadata schemas or just kind of ontologies that I create in order to render something computationally tractable is in and of itself an interpretation which is inherently qualitative as well. So you know, these ideas of these divides, as much as there are different skills, they're much more closely related, I think, than
Yeah, this is super interesting discussion. I think it's kind of democratizing in a way. So it's interesting that none of you have had like formal training. And many of this is a lot of experimentation and self-teaching. So we will just hand over to Emma if you're Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? So yeah, I mean, I think I'm very much still on that steep learning curve, really learning on the job. My background is not remotely in digital mapping or digital humanities, but the idea of creating this resource kind of necessitates these range of skills. So obviously we have had, Emma and I are both historians, very familiar with our respective archives. So really developing this has been a very collaborative process, and we've been working with the software engineer for the prototype. And it's really been a super interesting process involving a lot of back and forth communication about what makes sense, what is legible to us as historians, what makes sense from a developer's point of view, and figuring out how to bring that all together. And it's still, as I say, very much a work in progress, but I think it was really just from Emma and my point of view, seeing the phenomenal potential that a large scale online interactive database and digital map, the potential that had for asking new research questions as historians, for making this accessible, has just necessitated that the fact that we are still learning and collaborating, and it is a difficult process, but I think one that's really rewarding.
I also just wanted to extend what I was saying before about the project we're working on at the moment. Of course, it would be deeply problematic of me not to say this, is that the actual development work is being done by Tash Sophia, who's our developer on the project. And a big shout to her for the incredible work that she does. A lot of people, when I give talks like this, or in general, assume that the white beardy guy is the guy who does all the coding and all the development work, and that I know how to program and write code myself and everything else. I know a little bit of that stuff, but I'm not the person who does that work on our project. I'm kind of the in-between person who helps translate. So some of the work of the historians on the project who haven't done this sort of work before to develop and kind of sit in that middle point of prototyping and helping to do the design work, but I don't do the actual coding.
As a big follow-up on that, how did you find your collaborator? You know, what was the process in that? Is that an open call? Is it through existing connections? What's the
In this case, she was already on the project when I joined. So that's probably a question for Anne.
we'll put it on notes.
But she had I think she started a PhD at the School of Art and Design here initially, which she hadn't continued at that stage, but had connections in ANU, so through that project.
Yeah. To zoom out slightly, excuse the horrible pun. You know, you've all come at this from really different sort of backgrounds. The projects have different kind of genealogies, I guess. But I think a lot of people will be interested in kind of what, based on your experience, what are the kinds of projects that are suited to this sort of digital mapping output? Is there particular kinds of research topics or research questions? Are there particular data sets? You know, what goes into thinking that this could actually work as a digital mapping sort of output? So it's a very broad question, so feel free to pad while thinking of responses, but if anyone wants to jump in.
Yeah, well, it probably all comes down to feasibility. So probably the first thing you need to do is think about, is this achievable? So I mean, some of the typical projects that might lend themselves to digital humanities are ones that where there is a pretty clear need for data driven answers, where you can actually list things in a very large spreadsheet, and also ones where data is already available. So if it's a data driven project, but all of that information is locked up in text that hasn't been scanned, or text, even if it has been scanned, you might still need to type it all into a spreadsheet. Is that going to take a research assistant 2 weeks, or is it going to take 10 years, in which case it's not possible? So you might look for scenarios where there's already existing neat data sets that are going to make your life easy, and if not, are you going to be able to do that data entry yourself? Yeah, but definitely shouldn't replace conventional or traditional research, though. I mean, people do sometimes get a bit paranoid that the computers are going to take over, but they definitely shouldn't. They just, it just augments your research. It probably, you'll probably factor it into your research.
Yeah, and so I know Emma is ready to go, so we can get Ruth to do the switcheroo. And
Sorry, am I jumping in?
yes, please.
Okay. I think in our case, part of what really about this project that lends itself to digital mapping is just that we're dealing with very large numbers. And importantly, we still don't know precise numbers. We don't know how many people were taken from a particular location, we don't know how many Pacific Islanders were sent to colonial Australia. So because we are dealing with large and unknown numbers, this is a really useful way to start building that information up, just in terms of the raw data. And obviously for this project, because it's one about the movement of people, digital mapping it's a great way to visualize that, but I think there is also a significance to seeing those patterns of movement, and that corresponds once again to the impact that the extraction of people from particular places has had and continues to have.
Thanks, Emma. Did Ken or Mike, did either of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, in terms of mapping projects, I suppose I've also been thinking a lot about, just beyond the kind of the visual of a kind of Cartesian or Euclidean map, also the technologies that have this kind of cartographic lens, I suppose, behind them as well, that one is using to create these kinds of interfaces. So I've been particularly interested in the limitations of using named entity recognition, which something like Stanford NER is a pretty standard kind of, I suppose, package for any digital humanities projects. But I suppose that the small project that I just presented pretty clearly demonstrates just how explicitly limited that technology is in its off-the-shelf kind of application. You know, a place name in journalism versus a place name in fictional text are totally different things, even though superficially they may appear to be somewhat synonymous. So a kind of literacy, I suppose, projects that work are ones that, I mean, are built on great optimism about the potential of the technologies, but also a realistic appraisal of what the technology itself actually thinks language is. Because if you treat the kind of, you know, this algorithm as something which thinks that all language is text, you know, as a literary scholar, you might have just shot yourself in the foot. Because, yeah, now you've got this thing that just pulled out place names, and place names could be anything really in literature. And not only does it kind of pull out this indiscriminate entity, but it also just doesn't do it very well because it's trained on journalistic material. So I suppose, yeah, I suppose the projects that, well, I don't put a black qualitative word around it, but certainly, yeah, critical, yeah, reflection of the technologies itself, rather than just something that extracts this like metaphysical thing from the text, the truthy thing from the text, I think is helpful.
I think from our point of view, our project has become less and less kind of data driven the further along we've gone, and has turned into something quite different from where we started. It's, you know, we started out thinking, well, we need a big kind of relational database. We need to be capturing information about place and people and event and timescales and building timelines and doing that kind of work. And the kind of place we've ended up, you know, moving away from those initial experiments that I showed, which is bringing in data sets from the Atlas of Living Australia and other kind of elements. We've moved much closer to working with something like that painted map by Leah Magai, and thinking, well, how can we present this in a digital space where people can interact with it a bit? But it's about using maps and geographic representations as part of kind of multimodal storytelling. And from our point of view, it's not so much a research tool and something where we're looking to answer research questions using geographic data or these sorts of tools. It's very much about how can we communicate this in an engaging kind of interactive way to broad audiences of people that doesn't require someone to read a scholarly journal article or read 8,000 words of text written by a historian with footnotes through it, but includes maps to give senses of place, things that people can click on and interact with, but it will also include video and photographs and audio recordings and other sorts of kind of multimodal elements. So that the maps are definitely in there, but it's less of a data-driven atlas than the initial kind of project conception has moved much more into that kind of storytelling mode.
Yeah. I'll just echo some of the points made. Like another good candidate for a digital mapping project is one where will a visualization help you answer a question? Will it help you see patterns, as Emma said, that you couldn't see before? And also, one of the interesting things about digital humanities is how it problematizes or throws up very difficult questions for the usual IT way of doing things. How do you, well, one of the projects I worked on, the Enron archive, was about early modern women's manuscripts, which were produced before printing conventions had been established. And part of the point of it was that they didn't fit common repeatable standards, which is what we really need to build databases and so on. So it's the way that the humanities materials, or for example, in mapping, as you just said, if you were in science, I guess you would always think of a map as a digital map as like the Colonial Frontier Massacres map. There's a picture of the world with points and lines and polygons on it. But in humanities, we immediately think, well, an oral narrative can be a map as well, in that it tells you what order places come in, where they are in relation to each other, and the meaning of them, and so on. So yeah, if we want to do digital mapping in humanities, we have to be able to handle multimedia. Yeah.
Really interesting responses, everyone. Thank you. I can see that the Zoom chat is kicking off. And so just quickly, I think Emma has just answered the first of the Zoom questions in the chat. So thank you, Emma. Lyndall Wright has, I mean, feel free to speak if you would prefer, Lyndall, but Lyndall has pointed out just explaining some of the background to the Massacre Map project, the way that it grew out of her book, Tasmanian Aborigine, the history since 1803, where the cartographer completing the maps pointed out that 20 massacres could be recorded digitally, and suggested an Australia-wide map of frontier massacres could be possible. And so new technologies had made it kind of possible to imagine that this could be done. And then we've got a point from Steve, who is able to talk about the transatlantic slave trade database, which, given Emma's connections with it, I'll get Ruth to switch over the audio, and Steve, feel free to jump in.
If you can hear me. If people have any questions about the slave trade database, I'm happy to answer them, since I was one of the people who started it in 1995.
I'm Steve, just of what was the first step for you and your team in the sort of data collection, like just following off the conversation we've been having about software to use and spreadsheets and data. I can imagine things would be a bit different in 95. So what was the approach?
Yeah, you first have to get people willing to do it. So projects are great having a lot of people, but it ends up being a couple people doing the lion's share of the work. So you have to get some devotees who are going to work on the project nonstop. We had 2 years at Harvard without teaching, which gave us some time to work on it. But our project was essentially a database project in the days before, proper relational database software. So it ended up being more or less an SPSS, like an Excel spreadsheet. And the original data would have been, thinking of it like Excel, 27,000 rows times about 200 columns. And everything had to be typed out. So if you want to rely on optical character recognition, you're going to be unhappy. It's just too many errors. It's just easier to type it up from scratch. So my one suggestion would be find people who have a lot of time and are willing to really work on it. And you don't get a lot of credit for it among your employers if you're at universities. And optical character recognition technology is, it's improved, but it's still not great. A lot of it, we decided to sort of do the back-end database. This was sort of before you could have a lot of visual cool stuff. So, in hindsight, it should have been developed as a relational database at the start, and it wasn't, because that was a bit of a different thing. I've subsequently done relational databases and put them on the web. But I think having a core data set is always useful. You can add then graphic elements, maps, the graphics to it, and just getting the thing to function was a big deal. And getting the functionality on the web was like a prototype that showed it worked, and that enabled us to get a lot more funding. So we had sort of small funding, we showed it worked, got more funding, we showed it worked better, and got more funding. So nothing beats having a prototype that actually works, because if you don't have that, it works, that you can show on the web, it's awfully hard to convince people to give you money. And we also had to have a lot of work study students in the United States because coding is very expensive. You just can't afford full-time coders competing with the marketplace. And in the States, they'd be international students on a work study kind of a visa where we could hire people for a lower cost than a coder would cost. So cost for coding is quite extreme. And to be honest, people should learn it themselves, because it's too expensive. And you should probably learn Adobe Illustrator and how to do graphic arts and just do it yourself. So get on YouTube and learn how to do stuff, I think is a suggestion.
Thanks, Steve, for that. And we've had another comment in the chat as well, which I won't read out because it is quite extensive, but drawing attention to some of the really interesting sort of environmental applications, including in Canberra, including the CSIRO collection, the Butland Archive. There could be some really interesting applications for these ideas as well. I will just open up. Did anyone in the room have questions? Yeah.
Thanks. That was a really interesting. I'm from art history doing a PhD, but I have a background in art publishing at Sydney Uni. And my question is about infrastructure. Trying to build the infrastructure for publishing that's multimodal that does this kind of work, but can't do everything for everyone, of course. And my question is about, so you're describing this, how did you get into digital humanities? But it seems to me we've now come to this point where it just isn't humanities and people are finding their way digitally because that's part of what life is, right? Publishing needs to do the same thing, and academic publishing in particular is kind of text-centric forms of knowledge, and as we see with different mapping projects, we can understand things differently in various ways. So I'm just wondering about these individual projects. What a kind of future, or perhaps even things moving at the moment, might look like for a more standard approach across people who perhaps don't have the resources and the teams and those sorts of things. So there's the ARDC framework, which is to build the humanities infrastructure. I'm wondering if there are exemplars, or if there are, I've seen a few things about, but often it's kind of a wealthy university doing bespoke things, or a good big ARC project, or an individual who has the do-it-yourself, I'm going to YouTube it, build it myself. Just kind of wondering if you've seen any movement in that kind of middle space, or what you'd like to see, I guess, is the question.
I feel like Bill should talk about TLC maps. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we've tried to grapple with that problem with TLC map, which is meant to make digital mapping specifically as easy for, or easier for, humanities researchers. And it is meant to be infrastructure, and they've got an infrastructure grant. But we face probably similar problems to most people trying to do infrastructure in humanities, in that humanities activities are often very idiosyncratic and peculiar to the project.
Yeah.
And that even if there are commonalities, part of the point of doing a project is typically figuring out what's that unusual thing about it.
Yeah.
What is the information I'm going to add to it? And humanities people are often interested in marginality and things that don't fit into structures anyway. So it's very difficult. But our approach is, I mean, to find what those commonalities are. So one commonality is that a lot of people need a map with points on it, with information that pops up when you click the point. Now you could customize that and take it further and try and meet historians' needs, or art historians' needs, or linguistics needs. But then it becomes, potentially infinitely complicated. So our strategy for that is that we provide a way to make it easy to get the simple basic starting point without having to employ developers and have a 6-month grant and so on, very costly. Something you could just get a research assistant perhaps to do, or do yourself. And then that, like, often a little accomplishes a lot. Sometimes you just need that map that tells a story, and
the proof of concept, like Steve was saying.
Yeah, proof of concept, yeah. But beyond that, if you do have a grant for 3 years or whatever and develop a bespoke application, our infrastructure is meant to be compatible with it in terms of using open standards and so on. So you can export information from your bespoke system and put that into TLC map, and you can export, so your prototype from TLC map as the starting point for your project, and link them both together in a sort of mutually beneficial way, in that if people come to TLC map, they'll still find your project And ultimately, if you were to build a system that did do all the things and it was based around a map, when you clicked on a point on the map, it would take you to some bespoke functionality. And that is exactly what's going to happen if you get the data from your bespoke project and put it in TLC map. You'll see TLC map, there'll be a dot, you'll click on it, and it goes to your bespoke solution. It might be linking to a photograph in your archive with all the context that somebody needs to interpret or whatever it is.
And you could remake that interface. You could do it the other way as well, right? So using TLC map data. I'm thinking of TLC map being like the prototype and proof of concept.
Yeah.
Thinking as publisher, I'm like, okay, so what pieces of that do I pick up and then make for particular audiences? Make it look different or have different languages or things like that. So, yeah, that's really interesting. That's good to see that it's now, expanding beyond the project into something like that.
Yeah.
There are also other tools that are available that I've used before for kind of prototyping of things, really basic ones like StoryMap.js, where you can put a few points on a map, add video, add photographs, navigate through a map and tell a story going from point to point, for example, which you can also use with large-scale images. So something like that painted map, I can create a sort of story map of that where you're navigating around that as if it's a map, but you don't need to geolocate it first. And bigger ones like ArcGIS Story Map, which at least universities like ANU has a subscription to, and you can log into, where you can create more complex stories that include maps as well as video and photographs and text and those sort of things. And I find those sort of things useful as proof of concept, not just in terms of explaining to people by showing people what something might look like, but also something where you can very quickly do a kind of responsive version that you can take back to Indigenous community, for example, and say, well, here's the initial content you gave us, here's roughly what we want to do with it, this is what it might look like if you start to navigate through. And before you invest that time in building the kind of bespoke thing that presents this stuff in another kind of way.
And hopefully disrupt the ArcGIS version that a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Cool.
So we are very much running out of time, which is unfortunate. So I'm going to throw to Rodney for probably the last question.
Thanks, Ron. I find that when humanities people are presented with digital mapping, the question we often immediately think is, well, I've got a lot of data, but how do I choose what I map, given that it is, as Bill said, often idiosyncratic and quite awkward. So I'm wondering if you guys can say a few words about the initial choices for humanities researchers, and as a more precise application of that, Emma, your database seems to start with ships. Let's call them slave ships. Was that the obvious choice? Were there other ways to do it? I can't help but wonder whether communities, for example, might be something one wanted to start with if one could, or would it be possible to do individuals? There's all sorts of things one can research. I'm wondering about the balance of the practical and the ideal when we make these choices.
Did you want to jump in, Emma?
Sure. Well, it's a really, really good point. We're starting with ships because that's what we were starting with when I came on board this project. I guess that is in a lot of ways a logical starting point because we have a lot of information about particular ships and those voyages. But ultimately, what we're interested in is the people who were on board those ships and the places that they came from. So I think further down the line, that will involve a different type of research that isn't just going through our archives, it is going and doing field work and finding out where those places actually were, communicating with people who are local to those places now, because so many of these places are lost to history. They no longer appear on maps. So that is something that, that I hope we will be able to do later, to build in a more island-centered perspective of this rather than like a focus on the recruitment ships. But in short, we're starting with map because we have an extensive archive. We're starting with ships because we have an extensive archive, and because that was how Emma Christopher initially conceived of it.
Thanks, Emma.
Did any of the other panelists have any final comments they wanted to share on that or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, well, in the first phase of any project, it's probably going to be, well, in IT, it's called business analysis, where you figure out what you're doing and what the underlying data structures are in the mess of information. So sometimes it comes down to feasibility, like how much time do I have to spend in archives, and can I get this information even if I want it? And you know, balancing that against what's really important, what's going to answer your research questions, and also just figuring out what even makes sense as a category. So you've got 100 documents. Do they all mention, say for colonial frontier massacres, does it make sense to have a category for the type of terrain, the weapons that were used, the names of the perpetrators? These are sort of things we've had to think about. Are we going to include that or not? And partly that comes down to whether all of those 100 articles even have that information in them, such that it would make sense. But another important consideration in terms of structuring the information is so kind of, actually this might, how much time we have, sorry, but it's kind of like an inverted hierarchy. So people often want to put on the map, here's a place and here's all the things that I want to attach to it in like a big long narrative, maybe like a story map or something. Here's a place, now I want to attach in my description, or when someone clicks it, they want to see a list of photographs and a description and some records from the database and so on. So they might start their spreadsheet by having the place name and then think, how am I going to put all of that just in this one description? How am I going to list images in a simple table format? Now, an IT person might go, well, that's why you need a database and not just a spreadsheet. But you can invert that problem and do it with a spreadsheet just by looking at the really granular level, a sort of atomic level, all the things that I have. Each of these photographs, I can attach coordinates to every one of those photographs. Then they will all be geolocated. Every photograph will have a dot. But yeah, in terms of digital mapping, rather than having a place and attaching a lot of things to it, think about all the things you have and attaching coordinates to them, I guess is what I'm going to do.
So we had better finish up there. It is 2 o'clock. So thank you everyone for kind of registering and attending the seminar, engaging with it and asking questions. There's some really interesting conversations that have gone on in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't respond to necessarily all of them, but it's clearly been a session that is hugely generative of ideas, and people are really enthusiastic about the projects that you have worked on and are working on. And so massive thanks to Mike, Bill, Finn and Emma, as well as Steve for jumping in, and Lyndall and all the other people who have contributed to these projects for your involvement in this seminar. Thanks.